The naval history of the Mediterranean encompasses some 3,000 years of recorded history. It is a history that has been marked by epic battles, battles that have heralded the rise and fall of great empires, and whose influence on the course of Western civilization has been so basic and so profound that the consequences sometimes defy imagination. Today we're going to look at the great naval empires of classical antiquity, the Greeks, the Phoenician Carthaginians, and finally Rome. But before we do that, we're going to take a little side trip to understand the Mediterranean as a theater of conflict. We're going to look at the Mediterranean not from the standpoint of tourists or even of students of its culture and its history, but rather from the very narrow perspective of the naval strategist. Let's call this the admiral's view, the view of someone charged with the conduct of naval operations throughout the entire length of the Mediterranean. It is a truism of history that geography shapes the battlefield, and it does so in two principal ways. It determines how battles are fought, and it determines where battles are fought. Geographically speaking, the Mediterranean is a gulf of the Atlantic Ocean. It is the world's largest gulf, roughly 2,000 miles in length, varying in width from as little as 8 miles at the opening of the Gulf in the Straits of Gibraltar to roughly about 800 miles on the eastern and western flank of the Italian peninsula. It is divided in two great basins, an eastern and western basin, connected by a roughly 200-mile gap between Sicily and the North African coast, a gap that's in turn broken up by the islands of Malta and a variety of smaller islands further south. The two basins are in turn broken up into 10 different seas. To the naval strategist, the Mediterranean offers three salient features. The first is that historically, the roads have hugged the coast. That is a feature of not only of geography, but also far-reaching geologic forces. The Mediterranean was formed by the collisions of the African and European tectonic plates. That collision produced a series of uplifts along the southern edge of the European plate, of which the most famous is the Alps. But the fact is, the entire northern boundary of the Mediterranean evidences this uplift. That means roads historically had to be squeezed in between the sea and mountain ranges that hug the coast. That meant that road traffic was singularly vulnerable to sea power, either by cannonade or simply by landing marines to interdict road traffic. On the southern shore, we have the same phenomena, but for altogether different reasons. There are few mountains on the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Instead, we have one of the world's great deserts, the Sahara. And here again, roads had to be squeezed into a narrow coastal strip between the desert and the sea. So on both the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, road traffic was singularly vulnerable to the effects of sea power. The second salient feature of the Mediterranean to the naval strategist is the existence of choke points. Choke points are areas where geography conspires to create narrow entrances to particular seas, affording an inferior naval force the ability to deny access to a much larger force. Moving from west to east, we begin with the Straits of Gibraltar that connect the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, which at its widest point is barely 8 miles in width. Proceeding east, there are the various approaches to the Tyrrhenian Sea, between the Gulf of Lion and Corsica, between Corsica and Sardinia, and then between Sardinia and Sicily. Between the Italian mainland and the North African coast is another 200-mile gap, formed by the Sicilian Straits, a roughly 60-mile gap between Malta and Sicily, and then another 120-mile gap between Malta and the North African coast, in turn broken up by the islands of Lampedusa and Pantelleria. Even further east, we come to the Straits of Otranto that connect the Adriatic with the Ionian Sea. There are the two canals, the Corinth Canal and the Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea. And finally, we come to the granddaddy of all choke points, the Dardanelles, connecting the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which at its narrowest point is barely a mile in width. The third salient feature of the Mediterranean to the naval strategist is the fact that the interior line, the shortest distance between 2 points, is invariably the sea route. To travel from Sicily to the North African coast is a sea journey of roughly 200 nautical miles. that same journey overland would take 2,000 miles. That means the sea power always has a decisive advantage over a land power because they have the ability to move their armed forces faster and more efficiently than a land power. It also means that a land power invariably finds itself with its flank on the seaward side. And unless it can protect that flank with its own naval forces, then it's always at risk at being outflanked or being attacked from the rear by naval forces. What this means is that it's possible for a land power to control a portion of the Mediterranean, but it's virtually impossible to control a large portion of the Mediterranean, much less all of the Mediterranean, unless it is both a land power and a sea power. This conflict between land power and sea power is one of the recurring scenarios, one of the recurring themes in Mediterranean naval history. Persia versus the Greeks, Rome versus Carthage, the Ottoman Empire versus the navies of Spain and the Holy League, the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte versus the British Navy. Over and over again, sea power and land power have clashed for ultimate control of the Mediterranean, a clash that it can only be resolved decisively when either the land power becomes a sea power or the sea power becomes a land power, and one side is defeated decisively in its own element. In 3,000 years of recorded Mediterranean history, this has happened only once, in 31 AD after the Battle of Actium, when Agrippa and Octavian decisively defeated the naval forces of Antony and Cleopatra and ushered in a period of Roman domination of land and sea that was to last for 200 years. Since then, no one has come close.